Bitcoin came about during the last financial crisis. It spent over a decade building and building and building. Now it's over $1 trillion asset that's being adopted by the largest financial institutions in the world, as well as state governments. And it's done that all in about 14 years. And that's an incredibly powerful thing. For something to emerge and grow on pace with the internet and to be considered a threat by global powers of the world within that short expanse of a time, whether or not you even agree with this is the way that the world should run, to ignore it is foolish.
Eric Yakes has an impressive resume. With a double major in finance and economics, he started his career at Lion Equity Partners, gaining invaluable experience in corporate finance and private equity. However, his true passion lay elsewhere. Driven by a deep curiosity about economics and a desire to demystify finance, Eric immersed himself in the world of Bitcoin. He realized that central banks create perverse incentives, and he saw Bitcoin as a solution. Eric wrote The Seventh Property, a resource he wished he had when he first discovered Bitcoin. Join us as Eric discusses his background, the flaws of the traditional finance system, and how Bitcoin can help create a more equitable world. But before we do that, I want to introduce our sponsors, Stampseed, the Orange Pill app, and Swan. Our partners are businesses and people that we respect, and our products that we at Bit Intelligence personally use. You're watching 21 Voices.
Economics was always a hobby of mine, and I was lucky enough to have been exposed to Milton Friedman. I read his book, The Freedom of Capitalism, Freedom to Choose, and throughout college, I was getting this Keynesian economics type education. I was lucky enough to have been exposed to that because I did all that reading in my spare time. And, I was always kind of understood from reading him, reading Austrian economists and other free market type thinkers that central banking was one of the biggest problems in the world. I was pretty nihilistic about it. I always wondered, how is this going to end? It wasn't until I really knew what Bitcoin was that I came to a conclusion like, oh, this is kind of how this process ends. I didn't really understand that there could be like a perpetual cycle that central banking and fiat expansion would be going through. And it just shifts from different countries, different regimes to the next. We have this historical cycle of power, and whatever country has the most military power is the next major fiat currency. And they go through a cycle of expanding until it's unsustainable. But Bitcoin changes all that because it can create the very first neutral system in history that's not really controlled by any government, at least in modern history. In primitive societies, money was always kind of a private, neutral phenomenon. And it's kind of somewhat of a reversion back to that standard without giving up the value that we got by centralizing money over time. When we centralized it became more efficient. That's kind of how I view the innovation of Bitcoin and a lot of what my book's about. We were able to capture a lot of that efficiency with Bitcoin and revert back to the decentralized properties that money used to have and make it neutral again. I think that's solving the biggest problem in the world. And it took me a while to come to these conclusions. When I first heard about Bitcoin, it was pitched as like a blockchain type technology to me. And me coming from the financial world, there's a framework of thinking that everybody's trained in. Every form of asset valuation really boils down to the idea of what are the featured cash flows that asset produces. And when Bitcoin was pitched to me as blockchain technology, I came to the conclusion it's a speculative investment. It doesn't have any fundamental value. I don't really even need to know how the technology works to know that I can't invest in something where I can't measure its value. And it wasn't until I came across the idea that Bitcoin was an alternative to central banking that everything clicked for me. I was like, oh, that's a completely different framework. It's not some sort of tech. This is an emergent form of money. And it doesn't require the centralization that our current financial system does to work. That changed everything for me, and that sent me really deep down the rabbit hole. And it took me a few years to really decide that I wanted to go all in on the industry, but I think that what got me confident was that Bitcoin was, one, solving the biggest problem in the world, and two, was at a point where it can no longer be stopped. And once I realized it couldn't be stopped, just like, this is inevitable. What am I doing? It's all I care about. Sometimes I feel like this industry was like created for me almost. And I feel like that's something that a lot of people in the industry feel as well, even though people come from a lot of different backgrounds. When people relearn money, you realize that money isn't something that's backed by things that are valuable. Money is something that's valuable. And this term money needs to be backed by something is more of a fiat form of thinking that emerged over time. And that came with our banking systems that needed to use paper, not even needed to, but chose to use paper as a form of money because paper is really efficient. When we were conducting trade in gold coins, it was hard to move value. When we had the printing press and double entry bookkeeping and counting, and then eventually the telegraph, paper was the perfect form of money for settling trade over very wide distances in very short periods of time without all the extra effort required to conduct that trade. So like that's a good way of thinking about what makes something a good money is how much less time and energy does it require to conduct trade with it. And paper was very good for that. But the problem with paper is that it required centralization, which eventually leads to political capture. And that's the story of history of banking systems, is that banking systems start as this private phenomenon. We wanted to use paper that was backed by something. And why did it need to be backed by something? Paper was good at everything for money, except for it wasn't scarce. And we needed to back it by a form of money that was. And if we tied those two relationships and we held that relationship together, then we had a really good form of money. But the challenge is that even though privately people were using this because it was good for trade, it required centralization within banking systems. And in historical banking systems, that amount of control is easy to take advantage of. Eventually, and this is the problem and where fiat money emerges, the government would step in and they would control the banking system, and that ultimately leads to the culmination of something like a central bank. Central banks create perverse incentives, they manipulate the price of money and the way that value moves, and they can control the fundamental value of trade within a society. It's the most powerful position that you can be in. If you want to control people, control their wealth. Generally speaking, governments always fall into this temptation of central banking, and the only way to stop it is by creating a system that they couldn't control. So we couldn't really fight technology. Technology goes where technology goes. What we need is to build technologies that are resistant to that change.
Please bear with us for a quick message from our sponsors. These videos take a lot of time to make, and we've partnered with brands we trust like Stampseed and the Orange Pill app in order to get the funding we need to bring you these videos every week. Don't store your Bitcoin in cold storage without stamping your seed phrase on an indestructible titanium plate. Stampseed is fireproof, rust-proof, impact-proof, and easy to hide. It has no loose parts and will give you ultimate peace of mind that your Bitcoin is safe and sound for the long term. Click the link in the description below for 15% off your stamping kit. When I finally got Bitcoin, it hit me like a lightning bolt. It was the currency of the future, the only money that truly mattered. But there was a problem. I didn't know anyone else that thought like me. That is until I discovered the Orange Pill app. Suddenly, I was connected with a network of like-minded Bitcoin enthusiasts right in my own city. The Orange Pill app is more than just a social network. It's a community of passionate individuals determined to change the world, one Satoshi at a time. This series is brought to you by Swan and created by Bit Intelligence. Remember to like this video and subscribe to both our channels for more videos like this every week. Thanks for watching.
When you look at money and you look at things like gold and silver, they were chosen as money because they had these fundamental properties that made them good money. And then paper money was good as well, but it lacked the property of scarcity. So there's kind of like 6 commonly accepted properties that are used to define what makes a good money. And Bitcoin, I think the innovation can be found is that it actually categorically has created like this new property, and that property is immutability. So if we have a good money that has a lot of the basic properties such as scarcity, divisibility, portability, acceptability, fungibility, and it's optimal across all those, what Bitcoin did is it allowed it to keep the scarcity aspect as well as all these other aspects like being portable and being able to move over distances very rapidly, and immutability, which means it's very resistant to change. So it kept all of those properties and still kept its immutability. The only way before Bitcoin to do that was to revert to its type of monetary system historically, like a gold standard or silver. And in modern times, it just simply isn't practical. The world has outpaced those types of technologies. So we needed something that kept up with technology and still maintained the fundamental properties that'll make it good and is resistant to change or any sort of political capture. So that's kind of how I'm defining the 7th properties that any form of money, even going all the way into the future, from an economic perspective, if we're assessing money based on properties, we should be assessing it based on including the 7th property of immutability. Over the past century, we've created the very first globally integrated fiat system where all the central banks of the powers of the world are acting together in the same manner, and they're perpetuating this fiat dollar system. So where we stand today is that debt to GDP has grown to the highest level that it ever has in history. And we know that the Federal Reserve and all these central banks are between a hard place and a rock. They have to either lower interest rates and further expand inflation and create and perpetuate the system that's running out of gas, or they have to contract interest rates and let it crumble today. So it's a decision of crumble today or crumble tomorrow. We know that politicians like to kick the can down the road to tomorrow. Bitcoin came about during the last financial crisis. It spent over a decade building and building and building. Now it's over $1 trillion asset that's being adopted by the largest financial institutions in the world, as well as state governments. And it's done that all in about 14 years. And that's an incredibly powerful thing. For something to emerge and grow on pace with the internet and to be considered a threat by global powers of the world within that short expanse of a time, whether or not you even agree with this is the way that the world should run, to ignore it is foolish. And it's really cool. I feel like we're a part of one of the greatest expansions of humanity in history that's going to emerge from this technology. And perhaps it takes much longer than we're expecting, but I think that one thing I've always been surprised with when I've been in Bitcoin is that things happen much more quickly than I ever would have expected. I wouldn't have expected nation state adoption to have occurred as early as it did. And I think that there's many more big things that are on the horizon in the coming years. And the deeper I get, the more confident I get that this process may be more rapid than we think. We're lucky enough to reside on the winning side of this battle, as opposed to some who weren't as lucky, and they existed at a point in history where the pendulum had swung all the way towards this hyper state-controlled fiat system, and they had no technology to fight back with. And some of the greatest, if not the greatest atrocities that have occurred in human history are all based around centralized power. And we stand here today, but cryptography is our weapon, and there's quite a bit of purpose in being a part of all this. I think living standards are going to rise so highly that we're probably going to get it to a state in our lifetimes where the nature of work is going to change. Things are going to become so cheap and abundant that we're going to reach this state, the end goal for humanity. When governments talk about creating jobs, it's completely reverse thinking. The whole idea, we don't want to create jobs. We don't want to work more. We want to work less. We want to automate, which means we want to produce capital. Capital comes from us producing labor, using our energy to take the resources of the world and create valuable things, and technology helps us do that more efficiently. We're getting to the state where if we can unleash through productive capitalism and a neutral monetary system all of the capital that we have today, I just think it's going to be so much more rapid that process occurs. And we're already in an inflection point in the technological world as well. Hopefully, we can get it to a point where, all the population of the world can get to have all of their basic needs met, as well as, people are free enough to pursue what they want. And I don't think that comes from control. I think that it comes from the opposite. It comes from freedom. And if we look at history and if we look at what's unleashed the most value, it comes from the freest societies. So Bitcoin's a tool right at the inflection point of other technological revolutions that I think is, it's going to create an outcome that none of us can really understand yet.
When you realize that our current fiat system is fundamentally flawed and cannot be saved, it becomes abundantly clear that the capitalism practiced today is not true capitalism. Capitalism cannot function effectively without a neutral monetary system based on hard money. Fiat money never works. It never has. We see it cause great divides between us politically because of the ever-increasing inequality. This inevitably leads to conflict, a great reset, and a new regime. Eric has helped us see that the alternate system being built today is Bitcoin. Bitcoin can help the world transition off this cycle of destruction and get onto a system that incentivizes peace, collaboration, and economic prosperity in a way the human race has never seen before. Stay tuned and remember to subscribe for the latest recaps, insights, and films about all things Bitcoin. This is 21 Voices. If you want to watch another episode, try this one here.